Do you remember the first time that you were transported by a story? Maybe you looked for the entryway to Narnia in the back of your wardrobe, or you waited for your Hogwarts letter to arrive. Or maybe you remember the first time that you saw the Laramie Project or Rent and realized that there were people in the world who were like you. Can you think of a time when a story changed your perspective? Now, I was a bookish kid, and one of my great joys was maxing out my library card and taking home a massive stack of books to lose myself in. I read all of the Hardy Boys books and fancied myself a bit of a detective, which once got me into trouble with the local neighbors and almost it warranted a call to the police. And it was often in books that I found a solace for my pain and language for my struggle. I believe in the power of stories to change the world, and in fact, if I can make a bold claim, I think that stories are the only things that do change the world. And so today I want to share my story with you, a story of how I went from being a fundamentalist evangelical to being the first openly transgender man ordained to the old Catholic priesthood. And through my story, I hope that together we can talk about how to create a relationship with our sacred stories that is life-giving. Now, in preparing for talking about my spiritual journey, I was watching some old videos. I was involved in a lot of performance stuff as a teenager, and I was very interested in using the arts as a ministry tool to raise the questions that I thought that no one else was asking. I wrote a lot of the stuff that I performed, and it was interesting to watch these videos because in them I can see themes that ran through my life. Even as a young teenager, I was asking about whether or not the church should be about judgment or love. I was asking whether or not the people who were hurting could find a place within our church. And it was also clear that I was wrestling with my own issues and trying to find a way to speak about them that would allow me to remain inside the church. I was homeschooled from 7th through 12th grade, and the church really became my social life. In fact, I was there so often that they gave me my own set of keys. And it was in this community that I first felt my call to ministry. And looking back, to their credit, this church gave me a remarkable amount of leeway and support. I'm not sure that they knew what to do with me because I was this quirky kid and I wanted to be involved in everything. I had a tendency to speak up and be a leader, and to their credit, they let me lead my life. I was constantly singled out and harassed by adults throughout that summer for being queer. No one said it in those words. We couldn't talk about things like that, but that was clear that it was what it was about. And it was also through this summer that I began to realize that forcing children to pray a prayer to Jesus didn't actually affect any real change in their lives. And I began to wonder what it was that we were trying to do as a church. And this was also the first summer that I confided into someone that I struggled with homosexuality. Now, this was before I came out as gay, before I realized that I was a transgender man. It's a snapshot in time of a kid who was full of public dogma but private doubt. I was longing to feel a part of a community but always feeling outside of it. And it's this moment that sets the stage for what's to come. Because it's at this point that I knew that my call to ministry was real, but at that point I knew also that it was going to be complicated, although I had no idea how complicated. I was unable to be anyone but myself. I started college that fall living in a girls' dorm and feeling completely out of place. I was attending actual classes for the first time since elementary school, although I will admit that homeschooling prepared me for college much better than some of my classmates because I was used to reading tons of material and I found homework to be easy. I can also say that I'm pretty sure that homeschooling saved my life because it kept me from getting bullied and allowed me to develop in a safer and more secure environment. Now, I went to a college that was affiliated with the church that I grew up in, and there was no smoking, no drinking, no sex, and no dancing allowed. And I remember in my freshman year meeting two upper-class women and feeling a camaraderie with them. It was the first time that I felt like I was meeting someone who was like me. And 2 weeks later, they got kicked out of school for being lesbians, and I got the message that I needed to shut up. It was in college that I first started to really doubt my faith. Things weren't making quite the same sense that they once did. And I was also deeply in pain, trying to be someone that I wasn't, but not understanding who it was that I was meant to be. I studied youth ministry in college as well as communications, and I still felt called to ministry, but now it wasn't being encouraged. I kept being told that I could be a children's worker because that was what the church did with women. And I started to raise questions in my theology papers, and my professors got concerned about my subjective view of Scripture. They could only see me now. I was floundering, and I wasn't sure how I was going to survive. I started to see an on-campus therapist, but as soon as she brought up something about my gender presentation, I quit going. I hid out in my room, and I distanced myself from people. I was wrestling with God during this time. I wanted to just ditch Christianity and walk away from my faith. I thought that that would be easier than trying to reconcile what I knew to be true about myself with what the church held to be true. But on the other hand, I was also desperately praying that God would fix me, make me normal, and make me right. And this back and forth with God would last for years. I met some of the theater kids in college, and they saved my life. Finally, I was around people who let me be myself. They didn't make fun of the way that I dressed, and they encouraged me. I wrote and directed 2 full-length plays in college, mostly with the same group of people, and they rallied around me and really became a family. In those plays, I was working out some of my own issues with depression and feeling like an outsider, and I was able to tell stories about the things that I couldn't say in any other way. One of the plays dealt with the masks that we wear in church, the ways in which we pretend that our lives are perfect while underneath we were hurting. And in that play, one of the characters came out as gay at the end. And this was a huge deal for me to be writing this character, for it to be played on stage at my school. And it was a way of working out my own faith journey and maybe taking my own mask off just a little bit. Things started to change for me around my last year of college. I spent the summer before my senior year as an interim youth pastor at an American Baptist church. And it was there that I was at first introduced to things like liturgy. Then in my senior year of college, I took a job as an intern at a United Methodist church, and they affirmed my call to ministry in a profound way, even though at this time I was still being perceived as female. It was then that I began to see that I could do the ministry that I was called to. By this point, I was starting to admit to myself that I was gay. I still had no language for my gender discomfort, but I was convinced that I would have to be celibate my whole life in order to keep from sinning. And I was also convinced that I could only be a youth pastor so as not to sin against having a woman pastor. And I realized that there's so many things wrong with those statements, but that's where I was at that point. A snapshot from that final year of college. September 11th happened on a Tuesday night, and the next night we had our youth group. And after the evening, I was walking out to the car with the youth pastor, and I remember saying to him that I was deeply saddened as I thought about all of those people dying and ending up in hell. And he said to me, "I'm not sure it works like that." And here was this good man, a man that I trusted, expressing that he wasn't sure he believed in hell. Now, I didn't know what to do with that, and so I just filed it away. And there were all these moments that were cracking this armor that I had built up around thinking about my sexuality and religion. And while in my last year of college, I accepted a job back at the American Baptist Church, and they held the job for me until I could graduate, and I became their full-time youth pastor. And I was determined to be celibate and not out while I was at the church, and so I moved back in with my mother. Now, the minister I worked with was an amazing man. His name is Tom. He was this perfect role model and guide for me, because he never pushed, but he had this way of asking me the right questions at the right time. He was also an avid reader like I am, and would hand me books to read, and it was during my time at this church that I was first introduced to liberal theology. Now, my first summer at the church, one of the kids in the youth group came out, and his family in the church accepted him, and I was amazed. I took him to gay youth groups and to pride events, meeting other queer kids and seeing something of myself in them. And I also realized that these kids were longing for someone religious to come alongside them and my first gay ministers. And this was all new and shocking to me. My mother and I fought over some of my new understandings. I abandoned my ideas of the rapture and of hell, and I embraced a God of love who maybe, just maybe, wouldn't abandon me because I was gay. And I also realized that sometimes you have to take an unpopular stand in the church, and a family left the church because I wouldn't teach their kids that homosexuality was wrong. Now, it was around 3 years after college that I met a woman and fell in love, and I still wasn't out at the church or to my mom. I was still living at home, and it became this kind of whirlwind experience because I was deeply depressed, and I tried to be a closeted minister, a closeted child, and a partner. And it all came to a head when I actually ended up in the hospital severely dehydrated because my anxiety wasn't allowing me to eat. Something had to give. It was a week or so later when I was actually outed by a Unitarian Universalist bumper sticker, so thank you to the UUs for that. And my mom asked me if I was gay and if I was in a relationship, and I came out to her. And it was rough for a while, but she's actually been pretty remarkable about the whole thing. And she welcomed my partner over and invited her to family functions. I resigned my position at the church when they hired a new and homophobic minister because I knew that it would be dangerous for me to stay there. But right before my final Sunday, I was outed by one of the youth because they discovered my MySpace page. This was back in the days when MySpace was a thing. And I had no idea about security settings, and they actually printed out my MySpace page and handed it in to this new homophobic minister. And I was asked not to preach my final Sunday because they didn't want me to be a bad example. And it was completely disheartening. But on that final Sunday, my partner actually came to church with me, and the grandparents of the young man who had come out my first summer there, they took me aside and they said that my partner would sit with them, and that if anyone messed with her, they would have to go through that. Now, these were people who had been in the church for years, and I realized then that I could actually be a gay minister. I took a year off after I left the church while I discerned if I should go to seminary, and I married my partner in Canada, and we moved to New Jersey. I continued to read every book on theology that I could get my hands on, and there was a shift happening in me. I was moving away from the emotional religious experience of my youth and steeping myself in education. I applied to one seminary and was accepted. I had no idea that Union Theological Seminary in New York had a reputation as a good seminary. I just knew that it was liberal and it was close to where I lived. I had no idea that it would change my life. I enrolled in seminary having gotten married 2 weeks before, and I was finally given intellectual tools to understand my faith. I was taught about the history of the Bible, about the ways that certain doctrines had been handed down, the ways in which the church used and embraced liturgy. And I was accepted as an out queer person. I was embraced as a queer minister, and for the first time I was able to serve in ministry while being my whole self, hiding no part of who I was. I worked at a camp in Minnesota for queer Christian youth, and it was such an amazing experience to be there as an out queer person of faith and to be able to tell the youth they were loved just as they are. And I was finally given space to deal with my gender discomfort. It was my wife who first asked me if I thought that I might be transgender, and I told her that even if I was, I could never transition because my family would disown me. But like any good reader, I read every book I could get my hands on about the subject and finally realized that this was the root of my discomfort for all of those long years. I came out as transgender my second year of seminary. I actually sent an email to the entire student body and faculty and staff coming out. In hindsight, I would have done that a little bit differently. But hey, rip the Band-Aid off. And I had wonderfully supportive friends and a faculty that was mostly on my side, but sometimes didn't know what to do with me. I had to listen to professors make transphobic statements in class and deal with classmates who, even after I had been transitioned for a while, still could not get my pronouns right. And I had to be a walking explanation for what it meant to be trans, and it was exhausting. I was still working pretty much full-time, attending seminary and trying to hold my now struggling marriage together. It was an incredibly difficult time, and because my faith had shifted so much from the emotional to the intellectual, I found that I had no real emotional support to get me through these changes. See, what the evangelical church gets right is that our faith, our spirituality can't just be about intellect. It has to be about our hearts being in relationship with something bigger than we are. So I had to find a way to engage my heart again without dismissing my head in the process. It was during this time that I took my preaching and worship class coupled with exegesis for the arts. And in less fancy language, exegesis is about sussing out what the text is really about, reading into the cultural context and figuring out how to make it relevant. And we were studying the book of John, reading the story of Thomas, and suddenly something shifted in me. I engaged with the Bible again for the first time since my evangelical days. And instead of the text being used as a weapon against me, instead of having to use the Bible to defend my right to exist, I was instead seeing myself in the text for the first time. And I was allowing the story to enter into my life. My head and my heart were once again engaged. And I realized that by transitioning, I had come back from exile. The exile that I had felt from my body, from the Bible, from God, from my heart. And it was a transformative moment for me. I graduated from seminary, and my wife and I sadly divorced 2 weeks later. She couldn't handle my transition, and we needed to part ways. And it was the end of that summer that I moved to Minnesota and started a new phase of my life. Now, when I was in college and after, I had fallen in love with some Catholic theologians and activists, Daniel and Philip Berrigan and Dorothy Day, to name a few. I also loved how connected the spiritual and the justice work was in Catholicism, and also how physical it all was. Some folks make fun of all of the standing, sitting, and kneeling, but I really love it because I appreciate the way that worship is embodied. And of course, though I wrote off ever being a part of the Catholic Church, I could no longer be a part of a religious tradition that it didn't ordain women or LGBT folks, and I knew that they would never ordain a transgender man. Then one day on Twitter, of all places, someone reached out to me and asked if I could help spread the word that the old Catholic Church ordained transgender people. Now, I had never heard of the old Catholic Church, so I asked him to tell me more. The old Catholic Church is an independent, progressive Catholic church not in communion with Rome that ordains women, LGBTQ people, and people who are married, partnered, or divorced. And the more I heard about it, the more I knew that this was where I needed to be. I was ordained to the diaconate, a transitional training period, at the Transgender Health Conference in Philadelphia. And then about 9 months later, I was ordained to the priesthood. Now my work in ministry is about doing theology and ministry that is centered on the lives of those who are on the margins. It means creating spaces where people can bring all of themselves to the table. And my ministry takes several different forms. One of the largest parts has been starting along with my colleague Brian Murphy, queertheology.com. Because we believe that queer and transgender people have more to offer the world than what we are not. We're moving away from Gender 101 and apologetics, which usually ends up being the same tired conversations about the 7 Bible passages that people say are about LGBT folks. Instead, we believe that queer and transgender people have something to add to the conversation. We believe that our experiences of our bodies and our lives have something to add to theological discussion, and this belief shapes all of the work that we do. We believe in queering Scripture. And I want to take a moment to say what I mean by that. Now, Patrick Chang is a theologian, and in his book, Radical Love, he offers this definition. The second meaning of queer is a self-conscious embrace of all that is transgressive of societal norms, particularly in the context of sexuality and gender identity. In fact, this term is best understood as a verb or an action. That is, to queer something is to engage with a methodology that challenges and disrupts the status quo. Like the function of the court jester or the subversive traditions of Mardi Gras, to queer something is to turn convention and authority on its head. It is about seeing things in a different light and reclaiming voices and sources that previously had been ignored, silenced, or discarded. It's this definition that guides the telling of our subversive stories, stories from the mouths of those who have been silenced, stories that have often been ignored or discarded. Our stories are subversive when we claim them and stand in the truth of them, even when they go against typical straight, white, cisgender male theology. This comes out personally in one of my projects, Walking Toward Resurrection, a transgender passion narrative. After my experience of writing about Thomas in seminary, I started to look through the rest of the passion narrative, and over again I saw parallels to my own life. Finding these parallels helped me to engage with Scripture in a new way, and also helped me to recover a love for passages that I had long thrown out of my personal canon because of the harmful ways that they had been used. I'd always been a bit skeptical of the readings of Scripture that cast Jesus as a gay man. I know for some people these readings have been very meaningful and healing, but for the most part, they left me cold. I understood what people were trying to do, but I didn't necessarily need Jesus to be gay in order to identify with him. Now, reading the story of the Passion as a transgender narrative felt different because I wasn't seeing Jesus as a transgender man or trying to update the story by putting Jesus into a modern context. Instead, I was seeing how the things that Jesus experienced were echoed in my own experiences. In many ways, this narrative is a conversation between my story and the story of Jesus' passion. Now, I'm not saying that the experience of transitioning is the same as the experience of being executed as a rebel, just that the story of Jesus, his marginalization, his experiences with his family, his experiences with his friends echo within my own story. Writing this narrative has given me the opportunity to read the Bible and find myself in the story again. I grew up believing and being taught that every single word in the Bible was meant for me. It was God's love letter. Now, as I learned about the different ways to read the Bible, I learned that it was not, in fact, all for me. And then when the Bible became used as a weapon against me, I struggled to see it as anything that I could have any use for. I definitely couldn't see myself within it anymore, not with people telling me that the Bible condemned people like me. Writing my own story alongside the Passion narrative has allowed me to wrestle with the text in a new way. It's allowed me to look for points of contact. I've given myself permission to write my story over and into the text. And I've seen the text illuminate my life, and my life illuminate the text. This interplay of stories has brought me closer to God and brought me back to my faith. And I no longer see the Bible as an enemy, but as a story that I can find myself in. I have a little sister, and when she was 11, my mom sent me an email saying that my little sister's class was writing an operetta on heroes, and that she chose me as her hero. Now, my mom hasn't told my sister about my transition, but my sister has seen me since I started transition, and we talk on the phone. And in a lot of ways, I know that she gets it, even without being told. She might have the language, not have the language, but she's seen me undergo transition. And I am still her sibling, and she claims me as her hero. And I realize that in some ways, I transitioned for her. Because as her older sibling, I want my sister to be happy in the world. I want her to be at peace in her own skin. I want her to wake up in the morning, look in the mirror, and love who she sees. I want her to walk through the world with her head held high, and I want her to be her most authentic self at all times. And how could I possibly inspire her to be herself if I wasn't being myself? If every time I looked in the mirror, I hated the person I saw staring back at me. If I continued to walk with my shoulders rounded in order to hide my chest. If once I started transitioning, I avoided coming home to see my family because I didn't want them to know about me. How could I possibly be an example to her if I hated myself and was ashamed of my life? This is my body broken for you so that you understand that sometimes you have to do hard things that no one else understands in order to be true to yourself. Sometimes people will hate your body or judge your body, whether because of how it looks, what color your skin is, or who you love with it. That doesn't matter. What really matters is that you can look in the mirror and love who you are. This is my body broken for you so that we can both learn to hold our heads up high, so that we can learn to look in the mirror and love what we see. This is my blood shed for you so that you know that even if you have to bleed, you know that it will be okay in the end. So that you know that we are family and that the same blood runs through both our veins, even if you were grafted into the family by adoption or marriage or love. We are family. This is my blood shed for you so that you understand that doing the things that you know are right, even when people don't agree, isn't enough to make the people who matter stop loving you. So Jesus knew that even after he died, he would be remembered and carried on in the lives of the people who loved him. He knew that living the life he was called to, even if it meant death, was a better example for the people he loved than playing it safe and walking away unscathed. And this is the legacy that I want my siblings to have. To know that a life lived truly, authentically, bodily is a life well lived. I want them to know that to follow your heart, to follow your gut, even if it leads you to scary places, is worth it. I want them to know that no matter who they are, they will be held in my embrace and love. And so I broke my body for them so that I could show them that even with scars, you can be okay. To be wholly yourself, living wholly in your body, is a holy endeavor. This is my body, this is my blood, for you. Jesus, in his resurrected body, keeps his scars. Now, I don't know about you, but I had always been taught that when we got our new resurrected bodies, they would be perfect. But Jesus still has his scars. Now, when I think about resurrection now, I think that it doesn't make our scars go away. Instead, it makes our scars holy. Amen. Our complex and flawed bodies and lives are made perfect in their complexity. We aren't fixed into some image of perfection with a size 0 dress size or set of six-pack abs. Instead, we are scarred and wounded and oh so holy. So I am learning to love my scars, to embrace my body in its complicated and queer state. I'm learning to be at home in my skin and to say, this here, this is resurrection. Now, I do theology in the first person in order to give people permission, but also do theology in the first person. To see themselves in the text and allow their own lives to be in conversation with the sacred scripture, because there's power here. We've often been taught that theology, accepted theology, is neutral and impartial. That's actually not true. It's just that it's been written by people that have been considered neutral and impartial, white, straight, cisgender men. But really, we all do theology from our own social location, and that matters. So it matters that we claim our own social location and claim that as queer and transgender people, we too can do theology. In my experience of ministry, I found that people are rarely swayed by arguments or facts. Instead, it is in stories. It's in stories of lives changed, stories of people coming out and losing and finding faith. It's in the Jesus story that continues to provoke and inspire even after 2,000 years. So how can we find and cultivate language to tell our stories? How can we find ways to make our stories heard? How can we stand in the power of our subversive and hopeful stories? I'm finding my life coming full circle these days. While I'm still invested in the church, I am a priest after all, I am finding less and less people who are seeking out religious spaces. And so I'm looking for new ways to tell stories to create change. And I found myself drawn back to the theater, to the place where I first felt safe to begin to tell my own story. And so, as mentioned earlier, I'm starting Uprising Theater Company. It's a company that will produce new work that tells stories that need to be told. Stories of marginalized people and communities, stories that bring light to important justice issues. And then we're going to partner with organizations doing on-the-ground work so that when people come to the theater, while their emotions are still engaged, they can get involved in bringing about change. This is a way to meet people where they're at so that we can continue to tell stories that bring life and give hope. Stories can change the world by inspiring us to take action. And we need more stories. We need subversive stories and queer stories and trans stories and religious stories, stories that are sacred and honest and true. So do you remember the first time that you were transported by a story? How the words made you feel less alone? Do you remember the first time you told your own story, haltingly and with a lump in your throat? We tell stories to connect, to inspire, to empower, and to change the world. So what story